네, 그럼 지금부터 2021 아시아경제공동체포럼 정리 및 종합토론을 시작하겠습니다. 어제 1일차에 이어 오늘도 여러분과 함께하게 되었는데요. 먼저 인사 올리겠습니다. 저는 오늘 공식 행사 사회를 맡은 아나운서 이승희입니다. 여러분 다시 인사드리겠습니다. 반갑습니다. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, we would like to commence the wrap-up session of the Asia Economic Community Forum 2021. So once again, my name is Jessica Lee, and today and yesterday, I've given the honor of being the moderator for this very special occasion. Once again, welcome all of you, and thank you very much for your participation. 오늘 이 시간에는 초불확실성 시대로부의 탈출이라는 주제하에 다양한 세션에서 논의되었던 내용들을 일목요연하게 정리하고 또 포럼 전체를 관통하는 종합 토론을 진행할 예정입니다. At this time, under the theme of escaping from the age of hyper uncertainty, let's summarize and look back on what we have discussed in various discussions. It will be very fruitful time to have a comprehensive discussion. So ladies and gentlemen, please be with us until the very end. Thank you. 그럼 지금부터는 정리 및 종합 토론을 진행해 주실 박재훈 아시아경제공동체포럼 사무총장님께 마이크를 넘기도록 하겠습니다. Now, please allow me to introduce Mr. Park Jae-hoon, Chairman of Asia Economic Community Foundation, as the chairperson of this session. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome him with a big round of applause. 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바라겠습니다.
Thank you. We are approaching really the end of the ACF 2021. As you see in your program, this year we have 9 special sessions, including opening ceremony and plenary session, plus just this session, wrap-up session. So from now on, I'm going to briefly try to summarize, wrap up each session. We're gonna have another speakers here, but only online. So soon we will have 2 more speakers for this wrap-up session. First of all, session 1 was held in the first day. Yesterday in the morning. This session is organized by INU, Institute for Unification and Integration. This institution is headed by me. I am the director of this institute. The subject of this first session was measures to establish a peace regime in East Asia. So as you see in the program, for this session we had 5 speeches, 5 presentations. But in a sense, the presentation, most of presentation is in the form of so-called interim report. But we can see the importance and interesting point of each presentation. So the first presentation was a kind of economics, comparative analysis of North Korean economic reform with Chinese experiences. On the other hand, speech 2 was a kind of political science. The title was U.S. Strategic Bankruptcy and its Implication for the ROK-U.S. Alliance. If you are one of the political science students, this theme is very important today because, this forum's main theme was about the one of the very important hyper uncertainty is the U.S.-China hegemony competition. So in this situation, how South Korea should act, should behave, even though we have alliance with U.S. So this presentation is touching upon this very sensitive and very important issues. Third speech was about the kind of public administration approach. So the title was Dispatch Strategy of Public Manpower During and After North-South Unification. Lessons from the German unification case. Of course, we know very well that the situation of Korean Peninsula and Germany is very different, but we can get many important lessons from the German cases. So this presentation is applying German cases to Korean cases. Another two speeches about the kind of another interesting field. Last paper is based on so-called jurisprudence or legal approach. They talk about the legislative internalization to establish peace of Korean Peninsula. Okay, and then moving on to session 2. Session 2 is organized by Association for Comparative Economic Studies. So this session was moderated by Professor Ali Kutan, but to summarize this session, we're going to have again Professor Joe Brother. Joe Brother, you are here? Okay, thank you. So Joe, just please just try to summarize session 2 and session 3 together, okay? So
okay, I can do that.
Okay, so maybe you may spend 5 or maybe 7 minutes for each session. Okay, please.
Okay, I can do that. So the ACES session had some common themes in it. There were 2 papers that talked about equality and inequality and their impact on economic growth. One was by Professor Das, and he used Indian household survey data. So he had surveys over 7 or 8 different years. They were apart by 6 or 7 years, but household surveys were conducted. And so he had data by year and by 89 regions. And what he was interested in is what's the effect of inequality in opportunity, that is your circumstances as a person, and what is the effect of inequality in terms of outcomes. Okay, so your income depends both sort of on your circumstances and how much effort you make. And on the basis of the Indian data, he found that inequality tended to be reduced at the bottom of the income distribution. That is, among poor people, there was greater equality. And he also found that inequality of circumstances, how you're born, what kind of family you're born in, what kind of opportunities you have, the greater inequality there is really bad for growth. Whereas, we would certainly like to see more growth, and that could come about through these improvements in people's circumstances, that they have more egalitarian circumstances. And he put forward some sensible and feasible political policy measures that could lead to that. So the related paper, and I'm sort of taking them out of the order in the program, was by Professor Capuno, and he looked at the Philippines, and very similar data, household surveys over a bunch of Philippine regions, and over a number of different years. And what he found was after 2012, the Philippines had a kind of a growth spurt, which he calls robust. And what that meant was that both regionally and among people themselves, that is, both among regions and among individuals within regions, poor people benefited more, excuse me, than other groups from this growth. So I think this is important for two reasons. Number one, it showed that growth can be pro-poor, that it helps poor people, and that in fact, government policies can help create this equality which helps poor people. So understanding that growth can be good and that economic policy can help poor people achieve equality, I think are two very interesting concepts. And these two papers really fit together very nicely. The third paper was by Professor Popov, and what he argues is that Europe and China, or Europe and Asia more in general, are very similar. They're very similar in the sense that they have a big government sector and they have low inequality. And he argues that this is a really good growth model, okay? And so he presents evidence that China and Europe have the same, he uses Chinese provinces and European countries because they're roughly similar in size. And he says that, look, when you look at these two places, the big differences in income distribution are not within a country or within a region, it's among regions or among countries. And he finds that certainly there are other models in the world, like the United States, that are opposite. Okay, there's general equality among regions, but there's a lot of inequality within the region. So what he argues that this model, the Asian European model, is a preferable model in terms of producing better living standards and economic growth. Okay, the fourth paper looks at, again, in a sense, a role of institutions. It's by a group of authors from Poland and China, so there's some nice international cooperation. And they look at China's outward foreign direct investment, and they say, you know, what drives where investment from China goes, and how successful is it? And what they find is that formal institutions in Chinese regions have a positive impact on making sure that investment goes to good places and that it achieves good results, okay? And they also find that good economic performance at the provincial level also has a positive impact on foreign direct investment. So again, this has some policy implications. It means that China, and I suspect this generalizes to other ASEAN economies that are starting to get into the business of outward foreign direct investment, is that good product markets at home, formal regional institutions to encourage law, to encourage good business practices, and the use of foreign capital to help finance some of the foreign direct investment can all have a positive effect on how well foreign direct investment actually functions in terms of going to good places and in terms of having a good economic performance there, okay? So that would be the ACES session. Then there was a session chaired by Professor Bonyoung Kim on Korean unification. And this was, I thought, an interesting session because I mean, there's been a lot of work done on Korean unification, what it would look like, is it feasible, et cetera, et cetera. And it all seems to use the same information. It kind of uses information about productivity in North Korea, South Korea, income levels, economic structure, and then people kind of mechanically, I don't want to be pejorative here, but they kind of extrapolate what will happen if and when unification takes place. So this panel really said, let's look at some different information about how Korean unification would work, different sources of information. So one paper, for example, said, let's look at history, and it examined 3 unifications: the unification of Italy and the reunification of the United States after the post-Civil War. So both of these happened in the 1800s, and it also looks at the unification of Germany in 1990. And history shows, I think, some convincing lessons. Number one, convergence between the acquired and the acquiring region is going to be very, very slow. Migration is an inevitable byproduct of unification. You can't stop it. And there's a need to really be serious about rooting out the old elite in the region that you're merging with. There's some boss and someone is going to lose. The second paper was interesting in the sense that it looked at the structure of the North Korean economy on the basis of entirely new data, and that is nightlights data. Nightlights, basically what happens is a satellite goes around the world and takes pictures of everything, very detailed pictures, and it does so at night. So what you really see is you don't see any buildings or cars, you see points of light. And the amount of points of light, their density, is an indication of what's going on in that region, what's going on there in terms of how many people there are, what's being produced, whether it's industry, agriculture, what have you. And so this is a really interesting study that used that data and studied the distribution of economic activity and living standards in North Korea based on this nightlights information. What we found is that regional output and economic structures have changed, and they've also been responsive to both policy changes in North Korea, but also to outside pressures such as sanctions and the cutoff of trade with China. So this is valuable information about what's really going on in North Korean economy and what its potential is for evolving to a state where a reunification would be feasible or possible. Another interesting study was done by Professor Austin and his co-author. And what they did was they did a bibliometric study of North Korean economics journals. Now you say, well, why would you do that? Well, obviously what people publish in North Korean economics journals is driven by what the interests of whoever makes decisions about what the journals are going to publish. And we understand that that is to a large extent a reflection of political interests and attitudes in North Korea. So there we had policy changes and changes in circumstances of the regime that are really visible in what kind of economics articles are published in terms of their topics and also in terms of their approach. The economics literature has over time moved from just being kind of doctrinaire Marxist criticism of capitalism to, I would say, more pedagogic and more pragmatic analyses of things that are important and of interest to the regime. Things like special economic zones, things like the effects of exchange rates. So this is a source of information about what's going on in North Korean policymakers' minds. And, to the extent that we're really saying we want to escape hyper uncertainty, well, the way you escape hyper uncertainty is through getting more information. So these were obviously different sources and new sources of information. The final paper was a paper by Professor Kim, who organized the panel, and he talked about the difference between marketization, that is to say, the allocation of resources through the market, and a transition to a market economy. So what he pointed out was that in North Korea, marketization, the allocation of goods, not just consumer goods, but other goods as well, is heavily linked to market transactions. But of course, just having market transactions doesn't mean you have a market economy. But what he shows through his research is that marketization, people participating in the market to get goods and services, also leads them to have higher levels of trust, more self-interest in their behavior. And what that means is that they're developing attitudes which are much more consistent with the possibility of a market economy. Now, he doesn't claim that, just because people buy consumer goods on the market rather than having them distributed by the government, that leads to, it's going to lead them to say we want a market economy. But he does show that attitudes do change and that they would make people in North Korea more receptive to a market economy that might be brought about by reunification. So I think two really interesting panels that provided information on really important topics for Asian economies.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Seems to me the Professor just Hastings presented maybe different paper from the title, which was printed in the program.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was a fun paper. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. Thank you. Then move on to afternoon session. Yesterday, we had the opening ceremony, and we had two keynote speeches. So now just I'm gonna briefly summarize what they talk about. Okay. The first keynote speech was delivered by former Minister of Education, ROK, Professor Lee Ju-ho. His conclusion is like this. Actually, the title of his speech was about the HTHT, high touch, high tech. Okay? It's a kind of way of the digital learning. So HTHT shows promise for the first teachers, because it radically reduces their burden of delivering content knowledge. Secondly, parents and students, it provides students with active learning experience for socio-emotional growth and the cultivation of their higher order thinking skills. Finally, to policymakers, it shows promises as a scalable learning approach. So he concludes that to provide HTHT for all together, we must turn this crisis into an opportunity. Secondly, smart, small, scale, smart. Lastly, build open, multi-sided platforms for leaders and innovators in education, technology, infrastructure, finance, public policy, and academia. Okay, second keynote speech was delivered by Professor Arvind, Propaganda, Columbia University. His conclusion was like this. First, India is likely to become progressively more important for Asia economically as well as geopolitically. By 2030, India will be almost certain to become the third largest economy in the world. Thirdly, to maximize its potential, India needs to reverse its current trend of rising protection. Lastly, to distance itself from the Chinese economy for geopolitical reasons and to maximize its own economic potential, India must aggressively negotiate FTAs with the EU, UK, and Australia, and strengthen its existing FTAs with Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN. Okay, let's move on to another very important session. It's a plenary session. Plenary session, we had many panelists, and so for this session, we invited another speaker who attended yesterday in this session. So please try to wrap up this session. Professor Song-Ba.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
So I'd like to summarize the plenary session of yesterday's conference. The session title was the same as the conference title, Escaping from the Age of Hyper Uncertainties. And we had one moderator, 2 speakers, and 5 designated discussants. The session was moderated by Ambassador Kim Won-soo, the former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. And he was an excellent facilitator of the discussion. And we had 2 speakers. One speaker was from Germany, Professor Christian Dreger from Europa Universität Viadrina in Frankfurt. And the second presenter was Dr. Heung-jung Kim, President of KIEP, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. And we had 5 designated discussants, Professor Joe Brada, who just have summarized the session 2 and 3, and Professor Satoshi Mizobata from Kyoto University, Japan, and Ambassador Wong-gil Shin, a former Korean ambassador to India, and Professor Ho-chul Lee, Vice President of Incheon National University, and myself, Sung-hoon Park. The presentation made by 2 speakers, I will briefly summarize. Professor Dreger has been focusing on economic impacts of COVID-19. After briefly introducing the COVID-19, he was discussing the methodologies to measure the impacts. And also he was presenting very interesting aspects of sectorally different pattern of corona impacts. First of all, he said the services were more affected by coronavirus than the manufacturing sector. Services with a strong human involvement more than other sectors, as well as developing countries less than advanced than countries in emerging markets. And also, at the end of his presentation, he was presenting about the characteristics of the new normal after the COVID-19. 4 points he raised. One is reopening of economy leads to faster recovery, but likely short-lived. We had some discussion about this statement. Somebody asked whether we would have V-shaped recovery, L-shaped recovery, but he presented it could be K-shaped, which means we have relatively fast recovery, but the recovery will not be long-lived. It would be short-lived, he said. And also, he said, high uncertainty of households and firms will persist. Gross dividends due to globalization of markets will decline as the speed of globalization will decline as well. And employment chances for the low-skilled will decline. So these were the summary of his presentation. And the summary of Dr. Kim, the president of Kiev's presentation, he was accenting the importance of technology competition and supply chains. And also he presented a nice picture showing that China was emerging as one of the technology leaders in the world scene, together with the United States, Korea, and Japan. And he presented the US strategy using the 3Ds concept developed by the World Bank. He explained how the United States attempted and also is attempting to secure the technological leadership and how China wants to cope with it. And also he presented Biden's China policy is expected to be at least as harsh as Trump's. He presented some implications, and the most important ones I'd like to present. One was that because of high interdependence between countries, he said weaponizing supply chains is impossible due to the high interdependence between countries. And number two is role of government will become more important in this time of in these times. And also, the more we pay attention to economic security, the broader the paradigm will expand from security for the economy and to security by the economy. So we were focusing our discussion on several aspects presented by the two speakers. One discussion was made, what does China want to achieve with this technological leadership rivalry against the United States? And also, how should we see the US-China competition? Is it the hegemonial competition? But we agreed upon that that is not hegemonial competition because China is not yet ready to provide the role of alternative to United States. It's a rather strategic competition between the two countries. And also, somebody mentioned about the three catchwords in recent and current trade policies of the US and European Union: technology, supply chains, and value. So he was presenting about the recent changes in trade policies of EU and United States, which is becoming increasingly value-based. And maybe he projected maybe there could be coming some time where the values can clash, and this can cause some uncertainties to the world economy and world politics. And also we have discussed India emerging as a major economic and political power in the region and globally, how to cope with it, and what is the real potential of India. We have had some discussion. So the session was extended by about 20 to 25 minutes. We had a very interesting and very lively discussion. At the end of the session, the chair, the moderator, was trying to summarize the discussion in 3 or 4 points. Number one is that China is not yet an alternative to the United States as a global leader. Potentially, can it be? We had not enough time to discuss that out. And number two is economic security has to be paid strong attention to in the future policy debates. Number three, a post-pandemic world could encounter greater challenges to especially human security and geopolitical security. And number four, Korea and middle power countries cannot sit down doing nothing. They have to gather forces and find common grounds to act. So it was a summary of the plenary session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Park. Okay, then let's move on to today, second day. This morning, we had 3 sessions. The session 4. Session 4 organized by Korea Academy of Comparative Economic Studies. In this session, we had 3 presentations. Two presentations. First one was about the Northeast Asian commodity exchange, and second one was about worker education and wages. So let me briefly introduce this association. Korea Association for Comparative Economic Studies is already now almost 30 years old. Actually, this association is just initiating the hosting World Congress of Comparative Economic Studies, which initially planned to be held in Korea, actually this year, but this already postponed to next year due to Corona pandemic. But it's still uncertain whether it will be held next year. So I hope the World Congress of Comparative Economic Studies could be held maybe 2 years later. Okay, then session 5 is organized by MAU and Youth Committee, just right here in this volume. We had 5 presentations, and they talk about the very live and very interesting ideas about how to escape from hyper uncertainty. So soon, maybe at the end of this wrap-up session, we're going to have a chance to hear one of the teams present their ideas. Okay, then session 6 was about Japan, Japanese Society for Comparative Economic Studies. This session was also just organized by Zoom. There were 5 presentations. Roughly, they talk about some kind of role of a state, mainly in Russia and China. So I cannot summarize details because I do not have chance to read any materials from this session. Instead, the Professor Mizubata, actually, he is a hidden organizer of this Japanese session. He sent to me his some kind of final say about the whole forum this year. I just going to read his message from now on. So it is no exaggeration to say that the current uncertainty lies in the size and complexity of the task. Above all, working towards carbon neutrality is an unavoidable challenge for the planet, and UNEP has published pessimistic assessments that show that even if the 50 countries that have expressed themselves reduce greenhouse gas emissions to virtually zero, the temperature rise will be 2.2 degrees Celsius. However, on the other hand, the global energy system is not in transition, and this has become a critical issue of economic security. Digitalization and innovation have also been placed at the top of the agenda for competitiveness in both emerging and developed countries. But the risk of surveillance state and information control have not diminished. If uncertainty is growing under the existing capitalist and market systems, despite the advance in AI and digitalization that should increase certainty, then perhaps the systems themselves need to be transformed. Great Reset was also an issue at this year's World Economic Forum meeting, and the new capitalist system has been discussed. In addition, uncertainty requires us re-examination of traditional standard and theory. For example, even though CO2 emission has been calculated from production, but the angle from consumer and citizens cannot be neglected. In practice, China exports so much CO2 to US, Europe, and Japan, and the developed countries enjoy such problems without any burdens. Then we must re-examine the China from another viewpoint. Finally, I would like to ask all the participants to re-examine whether economics and science really have the potential to overcome this uncertainty. It may be that economics has developed remarkably as the queen of all social sciences. However, economics has strongly promoted model-based approach, and in order to establish pure theory, economics often ignores the uncertainty of people's behavior. Due to the development of economics, economics does not necessarily have the support of ordinary citizens. This graph, can you show the graph? No? This graph, okay, shows the level of public trust in professionals in the US, with the doctors and nurses highly trusted. On the other hand, politicians and even economists completely distrusted. On top of that, in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, disagreements among scientists have often been observed, which have had the effect of undermining the public's trust in science. The right graph suggests a declining of trust in scientists in Japan. In order to escape hyper-uncertainty, economics and science are required to revive their authority and trust. According to Nobel laureates Arvid Banerjee and Esther Duflo, economics is too important to be left to economists alone, and there is no need to build a lot of collaboration. I would like to stress the necessity of interdisciplinary and international collaboration, and I am convinced that the ACF has become one way to this end. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you again to Professor Mizobata. His very excellent summary and message about his idea. Okay, then move on to this afternoon session. Session 7 was organized by Society of the Emerging Society for the Study of Emerging Markets. This session will be summarized by, again, Professor Brother, okay?
Okay, this was organized by Professor Kutan, but scheduling prevented him from chairing it, so I had the pleasure of doing that. And this was an interesting set of papers, some related and some, in a way, unrelated to the other papers. So let me try to kind of put them together in a sensible way. The first paper by Elgin and Yalamon looked at the policy responses to the COVID experience in different countries. And in particular, what they were interested in was comparing the experience of Asian economies to, if you will, global experience. Now, when we talk about experience, what do they have in mind? Well, they wanted to know what were the differences in fiscal policies, which generally, from their presentation, what surprised me was how innovative different countries were in pursuing fiscal policies. I mean, you say, fine, fiscal policies means more government expenditure, but how they did it, what they spent the money on, I found very interesting. So this international comparison, I think, is very valuable for policymakers in Asia if the pandemic continues or if a new event breaks out. I think there's some lessons to be learned from this. And they also looked at monetary policy. So they considered rate cuts and they considered changes in reserve requirements and macrofinance policies. And what they found out was that initially the Asian economies were more or less like every other economy in the world. So the amount by which they changed their fiscal stimulus, the amounts by which they changed interest rates and other monetary policy instruments, they look like the rest of the world. But as the pandemic continued, what they found was that particularly East Asian economies were much more aggressive than the average, if you will, global country. So nevertheless, the responses even in East Asia were heterogeneous. I mean, different countries did more or less, even though they all seemed to doing more than the world average in terms of policy response. But they also found that these policies actually work. So having a comparison between Asia and the world tells you, number one, who did somewhat different strategies for implementing policies to deal with the crisis. And you can also ask, were those successful? So I think that's really useful information for policymakers. There's, in a way, a companion paper by Ahmad, and that looked at the effect of COVID on ASEAN integration. So he looked at and his co-author looked at distancing measures. So the kinds of measures that countries, ASEAN countries, and they included China and Japan and some non-ASEAN countries that were important for the trade of the ASEAN countries. And they said, okay, so can we relate what happens in terms of trade, investment, and particularly tourist flows between these countries based on their distancing measures? And of course, the distancing measures are of two kinds. There's a distancing measure that is within the country. So you close schools, you close movie theaters, whatever. But there are also distancing measures that deal with other countries. So you require, for example, documentation for incoming tourists or business people, whoever, from foreign countries. They have to show that they've been vaccinated, or they have to show that they've had a COVID test in the past few days, or they have to self-isolate for 2 weeks after they arrive in the country. So they relate all those measures to the volume of trade and investment among these countries. And what they show is that these measures, even though they don't affect trade or investment directly, had a very important effect on the economic relations between ASEAN countries and other major economies in the region. So in a way, this complements the first paper because there's an issue of policies in terms of monetary and fiscal policies in the first paper, and then a different set of policies, distancing policies, in the second paper. And we see that both of them have important economic effects. The third paper looked at the effect of the pandemic on stock market prices. And so the authors looked at a whole bunch of industries and their share prices at the onset of the pandemic. And what they found was that the changes in prices depended partly on fundamentals, that is, the fundamentals of the firm's earnings, profits, what have you, but also on how investors psychologically reacted to the news of COVID developments, okay? It turns out that the COVID news had an important effect on share prices, as one would expect. They examined 3,000 firms in different countries. They find that psychologically investors were really strongly driven by news about the coronavirus in their response to share prices. Now, the final paper, and I think this was the paper that of all the papers I heard at the sections, was probably the most surprising, and it was by Willem Thorbecke. And he looked at the Japanese export experience in the light of the yen depreciation that was brought about by Prime Minister Abe in 2012. So the idea of Abenomics was to stimulate the economy, and this was done by reducing the value of the yen. And certainly as economists, we say, well, what's the effect of devaluation? And we have models that explain, there's an exchange rate elasticity. So, the exchange rate is the price. When you change the price, prices of imports and exports change. And there's also income. As incomes change, either in foreign countries or in our country, that changes imports and exports as well. What was surprising for me is what he found was that there's a sharp break in Japanese behavior between the period preceding 2012 and the period after 2012. In the sense that in the period before 2012, the big change in Japanese exports and imports responding to a change in the value of the yen was largely in terms of volume. So if foreign goods became more expensive, Japan would export less. If it could now earn more yen for exporting stuff, Japanese firms would increase exports a lot. So the response was on the volume side. After 2012, volume responses became very small. And so what happened, of course, was if you don't change the volume and you change the exchange rate, then obviously profits of firms are going to change. So if you're a Japanese exporter, now you see value of the yen has fallen, so you'll earn more yen for exporting a Toyota, okay? Then the old response was you export more Toyotas. The response now is, no, you don't export more Toyotas, but you're obviously making more money, in yen terms anyway, than you were before. And the companies is just happy to collect the higher profits. Now, this may be due to a number of explanations, one of which would be the increasing role of supply chain. So if I'm just exporting stuff to another country and the exchange rate changes, it's easy for me to say, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. But if I'm part of a supply chain, it's much more difficult for me to extricate myself from the supply chain and to change the volume of my exports. I think this, I mean, it was a surprising result, but I think it's an important result for other Asian economies, because other Asian economies face exactly the same thing. And the lesson for them is going to be, yes, now that you're tied up in these supply chains, when you have a devaluation or an upward valuation of your currency, whatever it is, the change is going to come in profits, not in volumes. And I think that that has a lot to say about Asian integration, global integration through value chains, and it's a fascinating paper. So this was really an interesting session, and I really appreciate Professor Kutan putting it together.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I think your time is almost midnight, right? So if you want,
It's almost 1 o'clock.
Okay.
So
Okay. If you want, you may leave. Okay. Okay. Next session is about the Incheon community. So as you see in the title, this session was organized by the private organization in Incheon. Main theme is about the plan to establish peace in Incheon, the border region. As you know well, Incheon has a long border region with North Korea, especially in the Yellow Sea region. So there were 4 presentations about the how to establish peace region in Incheon. And then final session was organized by actually this session is about a special issue. Why this is special issue? Originally, the session 3, special issue 1 and special issue 2, session 9, is originally designed to be published in our new journal, AGE, Asia and Global Economy. But before publishing in this journal, we asked them to make presentation for this forum. So that's why we had this session here today. But unfortunately, about the last special session, I do have enough materials for to summarize. So just I'll give you introducing some titles. Maybe two of them is talking about the RCEP itself. As you know well, RCEP is a regional comprehensive economic partnership. But another two presentation about the similar but not the same regional trade agreements and multilateral trade cooperation. So I guess from the title of those presentation, I could say that this session was very interesting, and I hope we may see the final output from the journal. Okay, we finished to summarize whole session. So now, as I announced already, we're going to have some session for listening from the one of team moderation teams who made presentation this morning. So They are, okay, are you ready? Okay, I'll give you just 10 minutes, okay? Okay.
Are the slides ready, or should I?
여기 슬라이드 안 되나요?
Okay. Good evening. My name is Hyungchul Kim. Earlier today, I was given 15 minutes to present, and I couldn't finish on time. And I'm now given 10 minutes, so I'll give a rather quick, schematized summary of my presentation. So today, I had the honor of presenting about a facet of uncertainty that threatens Asia, that threatens our world. And upon choosing for the topic of this MAU, I had a chance to contemplate on what aspect truly contributes to our current state of uncertainty. And some source it to the economic, some to the diplomatic, ecological, technological, and many others. And then I thought about the pandemic and its contributions to some of the unprecedented charges of inequalities, the digital divide, uneven vaccine distributions, and the like. And I wish to uncover what really underlie such grave threats. And it became quite clear that technological inequality, a very specific type of it, would be most apt and timely to be dealt with for this MAU. And so technology has always been a discipline of uncertainty because it raises questions for the future. My topic today touches on each question to some extent, but it pertains mostly to the final one, the question of accessibility and equitability. So borrowing from the words of Peter Thiel, I started out by addressing that technology and globalization are not synonymous, but are distinct concepts that run on different axes. And these are horizontal, globalized growths, exemplified by software technologies with low entry costs and less need for infrastructure. Then there are the intensive, vertical types of growths with hard to emulate, high cost technology, which I think are best represented by nanotechnology. And nanotechnology concerns any manipulation of matter at the nanoscale for industrial purposes, so it promises some of the most disruptive and pervasive innovations across disciplines and verticals, from material sciences, medicine, electronics, to agriculture, water treatment, energy, and others. And nanoscience and nanotechnology does not fare well with concerns of global equitability. So the 70% of the enterprise is driven by the top 5 leading countries, 90% by the top 10, leaving less than 4% for countries outside of top 20. And this is distressing for Asia, especially given that no ASEAN country, with the exception of Singapore, is included in the list. And so this premises for what's called nano divide, akin to a digital divide in some ways, but much more furtive and disruptive. I identified 4 most prominent threats of uncertainty. The most ostensible is the problem of accessibility. No other instance explains it better than the case for uneven distributions of COVID-19 vaccination. So the use of sophisticated lipid nanoparticles for drug delivery was only mastered by the few technological elite, and hence came the uneven productions and subsequent uneven distributions of vaccination. And it is apprehensive that the distribution of a tool so formidable and vital to human health are ultimately they lay in the hands of the few elites. And then there are the impairments on trade competitiveness with more nanomaterials replacing conventional forms of raw materials. Trade competency of heavy exporters of raw materials can be at substantial risks. And the third and substantial form of uncertainty deals with the apparent correlations between robustness of research activities within a field and their general profitability. The research has been most robust in areas that have been most profitable, the nanomaterials, nanoengineering, nanoelectronics, the usual powerhouses. But the profit yields by the red areas are still stagnant, and so are their research activities. And these are the areas I like to label as the impact fields, the ecology, geosciences, agriculture, and energy, which really wield a profound impact upon our daily lives, particularly for the developing nations. And it's apprehensive that the research activities in these impact fields have always stagnated, and so we must find ways to break the firms out of their complacency, to have them explore these unexploited but influential fields. And finally, there are the problems of nanoethics, responsible innovations, and toxicity. The worst imaginable future will be that in which benefits of nanotechnology are monopolized by the few, while their toxicity percolates onto the have-not countries. But the developed portions within Asia face threats of their own. Korea suffers from drastically disproportionate industrial composition, and Japan has been suffering from a chronic lack of workforce, especially for the technological sectors. And China is the definitive leader in nanotech publications, but their success hasn't been translated into applicable uses, the patents, and the actual products. So the so-called have countries within Asia are certainly not without their own concerns as regards nano divide. And before we get into resolutions, I addressed two distinct types of nanotechnological trends, which I think are often overlooked. On the vertical axis, there's the disruptive growth, how developed it is within a vertical, how disruptive it is to the existing technologies, and how irreplaceable it is. Then there's the horizontal growth, how pervasive it is, how much it is applied to other verticals, disciplines, and so on. And we have seen early growth in the disruptive axis, but they haven't been translated much to verticals outside the powerhouse sectors, the electronics, materials, and medicine. So we have been seeing smaller and finer microchips, but we have not seen affordable nano air purifiers or nano water filters. And I think that's a critical distinction, that innovation isn't a single axis endeavor, that there are the vertical and horizontal components to it. So the traditional remedies for nano divide are largely boiled down to a three-part cycle comprising of traditional ODA approaches, general education and capacity buildings, and sporadic international research networks. But I think they face either one of the problems here. First, they do not clearly distinguish between the types of growth they wish to attain. Would it be viable to expect developing nations to emulate developed nations and go on to produce the next smallest microchips? I think that's a considerably hard path, more costly and time-consuming. Secondly, a lot of these approaches are unilateral in that the support is provided in a single direction, so the interests for the developed nations are underrepresented. And I postulated that for nanotechnology, risky innovations toward the horizontal directions will be most apt because it will provide new niche fields for the developing countries and also most viable because of low entry costs. So rather than emulating developed countries for disruptiveness, they should strive to find their own viable horizontal growth to pursue pervasive development. They must also seek to find balance between interests of the developing and the developed nations to find more incentivizing solutions from which both sides can reap benefits. So I laid down three general approaches, one concerning the practical front, one for the logistic front, and lastly for the regulatory front. And I chose entrepreneurial approach as the first most viable option because it pertains adequately to the purpose of pervasive growth and suffices the interests of the developed nations in many ways. I took the North American Nano Accelerator model as the exemplary case and concluded that Asia has sufficient accelerator infrastructure and diversity to emulate their success. So I suggested a convergent nano accelerator program premised for Asia, with mutual contributions from the public and the private sectors and the entrepreneurs. I then suggested the corporate spin-off strategy deployed by South Africa that was used to marry their dichotomous economic sectors. And noticing similar dichotomies and presence of hard infrastructure megacorporates within Southeast Asia, I suggested that this methodology could really be transposed to ASEAN sectors as well. And then to support entrepreneurship for the have-not countries, I suggested new modalities to promote transnational coalitions between developing nations. The first of which is to initiate layers of consortia that would strategically identify their niche fields and embark on subsequent collaborative networking. Then to support And then the second methodology was to adopt the open source networking system for the strategic niche fields, allowing for mutual contributions from firms, researchers, innovators, and public users. And finally, I advocated for layers of nano-regulatory frameworks that would emulate the precedent of ASEAN framework, underpinned by a layer of nano-ethical regulations that would preempt indiscriminate innovations. And to sum up, all solutions for the three frontiers seem to be pressing for a form of united Asian network to ensure equitable nano-innovative ecology within Asia. And in due process, it would be most ideal for Asia to leverage this apparent crisis to formulate a strengthened, coherent regional integration in unison. So that will be it, and thank you for listening. And it has been an honor to be participating in this wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you. 네, 고맙습니다. 이렇게 2021 아시아 경제공동체포럼 양일간의 일정을 통해서 저희가 논의한 내용들 한 번에 정리할 수 있는 종합토론 함께 하셨는데요. 긴 시간 동안 함께 해주신 여러분, 그리고 이 패널 토론을 이끌어주신 좌장님과 패널 분들께 다시 한번 감사를 드리겠습니다. Thank you, Mr. Park, for leading the session, and thank you to all of our panelists for your discussion and your meaningful words. 네, 또 유의미한 프레젠테이션도 함께 하셨는데요. 이렇게 결선 진출팀의 발표 들으면서 이런 생각을 하게 되었습니다. 세대를 이끌어가는 이런 흐름이야말로 또 아시아 경제공동체 포럼을 특별하게 만드는 원동력 중에 하나가 아닐까라는 생각을 하게 되었습니다. And once again, thank you for the very meaningful presentation made during MAU or Model Asian Union. I thought that the trend that continues from generation to generation might be a very special driving force that makes Asia Economic Community Forum special. Thank you once again. 고맙습니다. 자, 이어지는 순서를 소개해드리겠습니다. 이어지는 순서는 본 포럼을 함께 해주신 다양한 연사와 패널분들의 키 메시지를 함의한 2021 인천 선언 발표가 준비가 되어 있습니다. So with that, we'll now announce the Incheon Declaration 2021, which includes key messages from our speakers and panelists who joined this forum. 네, 여러분 다시 한번 박재훈 아시아경제공동체재단 이사장님을 연단으로 모시도록 하겠습니다. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Park Jae-hoon, Chairman of Asia Economic Community Foundation once again. 큰 박수로 다시 한번 환영해 주십시오.
Okay, Incheon Declaration 2021. In order to overcome the hyper uncertainties surrounding the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, the political leadership for integration is urgently needed to promote the establishment of Northeast Asian Regional Cooperation Body. We are living in the age of hyper uncertainty. The hyper uncertainty is caused by US-China hegemonic competition, North Korean nuclear issues, climate change, the COVID-19 crisis, and the fourth industrial revolution. The Asia Economic Community Forum 2021, which marks its 13th anniversary this year, under the theme of escaping from the age of hyper uncertainty, rigorously discussed ways to resolve uncertainty-related crises surrounding the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. We noted the deepening of inequality within and between countries due to the fourth industrial revolution that lies at the root of this hyper-uncertainty, and agreed that in order to solve this problem, it is necessary to gather common wisdom from the global village. As a result of the discussion at the forum for the past 2 days, we agreed that political leadership for integration that prioritizes community building, regional and global cooperation and integration is needed to overcome the extreme uncertainty surrounding the Korean Peninsula. First, the United States, China, Japan, Russia, EU, and South and North Korea should discuss comprehensively the North Korean nuclear issue at the competition between the US and China for hegemony in the region in order to build the Northeast Asian Regional Cooperation Body that will ultimately lead to the establishment of a new cooperative order, not only regionally, but also globally. Second, in order to solve common global problems, such as existential threats, including WMD proliferation and climate change, as well as the COVID-19 crisis and the further possible global economic crisis, the United States and China should no longer engage in conflict and confrontation, but instead actively engage in dialogue and cooperation. Third, the international society, including middle powers like South Korea, should no longer take sides in competition between the US and China, but rather they should join forces to solve global problems. November 5th, 2021. Thank you.
네, 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 고맙습니다. 이렇게 2021 인천 선언 발표 여러분 함께 하셨는데요. 아시아와 세계 경제 흐름을 진단하고 또 심도 깊은 연구를 통해 미래 대안을 제시한다는 본 포럼의 목적과 의의도 함께 느낄 수 있는 의미 있는 시간과 선언이었습니다. 고맙습니다. We did announce the Incheon Declaration 2021. It was a very precious session that we can share the purpose and significance of this forum, to diagnose the trend of Asia and the global economy, and to present alternatives through in-depth talks. Thank you very much once again. 네, 그럼 공식 프로그램의 마지막 순서인 폐회 선언을 이어가도록 하겠습니다. 선언에는 연단에 계신 박재훈 아시아경제공동체재단 이사장님께서 다시 한번 수고해 주시겠습니다. With that, we'll continue with the closing remarks. The closing remarks will be delivered by Mr. Park Jae-hoon, Chairman of Asia Economic Community Foundation. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome him once again with a big round of applause. 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수로 환영해 주십시오.
Dear all participants, last 2 days we discussed many important issues. Especially we deeply discussed how to escape from the age of hyper-uncertainty. The hyper-uncertainty comes from the US-China hegemony competition, North Korean issues, COVID-19 crisis, and the fourth industrial revolution. We concluded that in order to escape from the hyper-uncertainty in this region, we need political leadership for integration to promote the establishment of Northeast Asian Regional Cooperation Body. I hope all of you have enjoyed the forum and share a common feeling and a consensus about our activities. Our journey toward the creation of the Asian community will be continued. I sincerely hope we will see again in the next year. So now announce that Asia Forum 2021 is closed. Thank you.
네, 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 고맙습니다. 자리로 모시겠습니다. 네, 이렇게 박재훈 이사장님께서 폐회 선언을 해주셨습니다. 이틀간 총 9개 세션, 기조 강연, 총회, 그리고 종합토론과 2021 인천 선언으로 함께한 2021 아시아경제공동체포럼 이제 이틀간의 여정의 끝에 왔습니다. 이제 막을 내릴 시간인데요. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your meaningful time and a total of 9 sessions, keynote speeches, plenary session, wrap-up session, and Incheon Declaration 2021. So this brings us to the end of our 2-day-long journey of the Asia Economic Community Forum 2021. 포럼 준비부터 오늘 이 마지막 순간까지 계속해서 성원해 주시고 지지를 보내주신 모든 분들, 또 온라인과 오프라인으로 저희와 함께해 주신 모든 참석자 여러분께 다시 한번 깊은 감사의 말씀을 올립니다. So we'd like to express our sincere gratitude to all of our participants who have been with us for 2 days and supported us from the participation of our forum until the start to the end of our forum. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for your participation and active interest. 또 현장에 함께하고 계신 여러분들께서는요, 잠시 후에 이어지는 환성 만찬에도 끝까지 함께해 주시고 자리를 빛내주시면 고맙겠습니다. 또 만찬이 시작하기 전에는 모의 아시아 연합총회 시상식도 준비가 되어 있습니다. 영광의 순간 여러분 부디 함께 빛내주시길 부탁드리겠습니다. For on-site attendees, please attend the farewell dinner as well, which will commence shortly. And we will have an award ceremony for Model Asian Union before we have dinner. So ladies and gentlemen, please be with us until the very end. 네, 그럼 이것으로 2021 아시아경제공동체포럼 초불확실성 시대로부터의 탈출 여기서 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. So this brings us to the end of all programs that's prepared for you today, and for all of our participants who joined us through this 2-day long journey of the Asia Economic Community Forum 2021. Thank you once again for your participation. So we had a 2-day long journey under the theme of escaping from the age of hyper uncertainty. I hope you had a really precious and meaningful time with us. And ladies and gentlemen, please stay healthy and safe, and thank you very much for your participation once again. 함께 해주신 모든 여러분들께 다시 한번 감사 인사드리겠습니다. 고맙습니다.